The fluorescent lights hummed above me as I stood at the counter, waiting for my paycheck to clear. It was a Thursday afternoon in March, and the bank was mostly empty except for an elderly man arguing about fees near the far window. I'd been to this branch 100 times before, always seeing the same faces, always going through the same motions. Nothing about this visit felt different. Until Sandra, the teller, looked up from her computer screen with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. We'd chatted before about nothing important, the kind of small talk that fills the silence during transactions. But now her mouth was pressed into a thin line, and her eyes kept darting from the screen to my face and back again. She excused herself without explaining why, disappearing through a door behind the counter that I'd never seen anyone use before. I stood there, confused and increasingly anxious. When she returned, she wasn't alone. A man in a gray suit followed her, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes sharp and assessing. He introduced himself as Mr. Peterson, the branch manager, and asked if I would mind stepping into his office for a moment. The way he said it wasn't really a question at all. My stomach dropped, though I couldn't have explained why. Peterson's office was small and windowless, decorated with generic landscape paintings and a shelf of banking awards. He gestured for me to sit in a chair across from his desk, while Sandra stood near the door, still holding whatever paperwork had caused this disruption. I felt like I was being interrogated, though no one had accused me of anything yet. The air conditioning was too cold, and I crossed my arms, waiting for someone to explain what was happening to my ordinary Thursday afternoon. Peterson pulled out a piece of paper from a folder and slid it across the desk toward me. It was a photocopy of a check made out to someone named Marcus Chen for $8,000. The check was drawn on an account I recognized immediately because it was mine. The checking account I'd had since college. But what made my breath catch in my throat was the signature at the bottom. It looked exactly like mine. The same looping letters, the same pressure on certain strokes. I stared at it, feeling dizzy. I told them I'd never written this check. I didn't even have physical checks anymore. Hadn't ordered them in years because I paid everything online or with my debit card. Peterson listened with that same neutral expression, then asked if anyone else had access to my account. No one did. Did I know Marcus Chen? I'd never heard the name before in my life. The signature, though, that was what kept drawing my attention back. It wasn't just similar to my handwriting. It was perfect. Peterson pulled out another photocopy, then another. 5 checks in total, all made out to different people, all for amounts between $3,000 and $8,000. All of them had been cashed over the past 6 months from my account. I felt the room start to spin as I calculated the total. Nearly $30,000. That was more than I made in half a year. More than I had in savings. My account should have been empty, overdrawn, flagged for fraud. But when I checked my banking app with shaking hands, my balance looked completely normal. Sandra explained that the checks had been processed through different branches, never at this one, which was why no one had caught them until now. They'd only noticed today because I was trying to deposit my paycheck and the system flagged my account for irregular activity. Apparently, someone had been making deposits to cover the checks just before they cleared, keeping the account balanced so nothing would trigger an alert. It was sophisticated, Peterson said. It was deliberate. Someone had been carefully managing my account without my knowledge for months. I asked who had been making the deposits, where the money was coming from, but Peterson said he couldn't access that information immediately. He would need to file a fraud report, contact the other branches, pull security footage. It would take time. Meanwhile, he asked me again if I was sure I hadn't written these checks, if I was certain I didn't know any of the people named on them. His tone suggested he didn't entirely believe me. I looked at the signatures again, and doubt crept in like cold water. I left the bank with copies of the checks and a case number for the fraud investigation. The spring air felt too bright after the artificial light of Peterson's office, and I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, trying to remember how to breathe normally. Cars passed on the street. People walked by with shopping bags and coffee cups. The world was continuing as if nothing had changed. But I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Those signatures looked so much like mine that I'd started questioning my own memory. I drove home on autopilot, my mind spinning through the past 6 months, trying to find gaps or blank spots. Had I been sick? Had there been days I couldn't account for? I'd been working my regular schedule at the insurance office, going home each night, spending weekends alone mostly, reading or watching television. Nothing unusual, nothing missing. But I kept thinking about the precision of those signatures, the way they matched every quirk of my handwriting. No forger could be that good, could they? Unless they had practice, unless they had studied me for a very long time. My apartment felt different when I walked in, though nothing had been moved. I stood in the doorway, scanning the living room, the kitchen visible beyond it, the hallway leading to my bedroom. Everything was exactly as I'd left it this morning. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here, that someone had access to more than just my bank account. I checked the locks on the windows, the deadbolt on the door. All secure. I was being paranoid, I told myself. But paranoia felt like the only rational response right now. I opened my laptop and typed Marcus Chen into the search bar, though I knew it was probably useless. The name was common enough that hundreds of results appeared, none of them obviously connected to me. I scrolled through social media profiles, LinkedIn pages, news articles, a doctor in Seattle, a student at UCLA, a chef in Boston. None of their faces sparked any recognition. I tried the other names from the checks: Jennifer Walsh, David Park, Sarah Mitchell, Robert Torres. All common names, all strangers. Then I did something I've been avoiding since leaving the bank. I logged into my account and started going through every transaction from the past 6 months, line by line. The deposits Peterson had mentioned were there, coming in at irregular intervals, always just before one of the fraudulent checks would have cleared. The amounts varied, but always covered what was needed, plus a little extra. The deposit sources were listed as mobile deposits, which meant someone had photographed checks and uploaded them through the banking app. My banking app. On my phone, probably. I grabbed my phone and checked the app history, the login records. Nothing unusual appeared. No strange devices, no logins from unfamiliar locations. Whoever was doing this was either using my phone directly or had somehow cloned my credentials so perfectly that the bank's security couldn't tell the difference. I thought about all the times I'd left my phone on my desk at work, in my bag at the gym, on the table at restaurants. How easy would it have been for someone to access it? How long would they need? The next morning, I went to the police station to file a report. The officer who took my statement was a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Detective Barnes. She listened to my story while typing slowly on an ancient computer, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions. When I showed her the photocopies of the checks, she studied them for a long time, paying particular attention to the signatures. She asked the same questions Peterson had asked. No, I didn't write them. No, I don't know these people. No, I can't explain why they look like my handwriting. Barnes explained that identity theft cases were complicated and often difficult to solve. The perpetrator was clearly sophisticated, she said, which meant they'd likely covered their tracks well. She would contact the bank, request security footage from the branches where the checks were cashed, try to track down the people who'd received the money. But she warned me not to expect quick results. These investigations could take months. In the meantime, I should monitor my accounts closely, change all my passwords, consider putting a freeze on my credit. She made it sound routine, like I was just another victim in a long line of them. I left the station feeling more helpless than when I'd arrived. The bureaucracy of fraud investigation was overwhelming, and everyone I spoke to seemed to think I should just wait patiently while strangers poured through my financial life. But I couldn't wait. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those signatures, perfect replicas of my own hand. Someone out there could imitate me so completely that even I had trouble denying it. That wasn't just theft. That felt like something darker, something more personal. That felt like someone was trying to erase me and step into my place. Back home, I pulled out old documents from a filing cabinet in my closet. Birthday cards I'd written, notes from college, the lease agreement for my apartment. I spread them across my kitchen table and compared them to the photocopied checks. The match was undeniable. Whoever had forged these signatures knew not just the shape of my letters, but the rhythm of my writing, the way I looped my lowercase g, the slight backward slant of my capital M, the pressure I applied at the end of words. These weren't details someone could learn from a casual glance. I tried to remember if I'd ever lost my wallet or had documents stolen, but nothing came to mind. I'd lived a quiet life, deliberately so, after the chaos of my early 20s. I worked, I came home, I kept to myself. I didn't have enemies. I didn't have many friends either, if I was being honest. There was my coworker Lisa, who I had lunch with sometimes, and my neighbor Tom, who I'd water plants for when he traveled. Beyond that, my social circle was essentially non-existent. So who would have this kind of access to me? Who would care enough to study me so carefully? I made a list of everyone I interacted with regularly. Coworkers, the barista at the coffee shop I visited each morning, my landlord, the woman who ran the dry cleaners down the street. The list was depressingly short. I'd moved to this city 3 years ago for work, leaving behind the small town where I'd grown up. I'd told myself I was starting fresh, building a new life. Now it occurred to me that I'd just become invisible instead. Maybe that invisibility had made me an easy target. Maybe someone had noticed how alone I was. Monday morning, I went to the coffee shop earlier than usual. The place was called Morning Grounds, a small independent cafe with exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture. I'd been going there 5 days a week for nearly 2 years, always ordering the same thing, always at roughly the same time. The barista, whose name tag read Sophie, knew my order before I reached the counter. She was friendly in that professional way service workers are, smiling but not intrusive. I'd never thought much about her before. Now I wondered what she knew about me. I ordered my usual coffee and then, trying to sound casual, asked Sophie if she'd noticed anyone hanging around the shop who seemed particularly interested in the customers. She gave me a strange look and asked why I wanted to know. I hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. I told her I was dealing with some identity theft issues and was trying to figure out how someone might have gotten access to my personal information. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern. She said she'd keep an eye out, but nothing specific came to mind. The shop was always busy. As I turned to leave, Sophie called out to me. She said there was actually someone who used to come in a lot, maybe 8 months ago, who would always sit near wherever I sat. She remembered because the woman had asked about me once, wanted to know if I was a regular, what I usually ordered. Sophie had thought it was weird at the time, but forgotten about it until now. The woman stopped coming around after a few weeks. Sophie couldn't remember much about what she looked like, just that she was younger, maybe late 20s, with dark hair. I pressed Sophie for more details, but her memory was vague. Dark hair, average height, usually wore jeans and a hoodie. Nothing distinctive. She might have had a tattoo on her wrist, or maybe that was someone else. The description could have fit thousands of women in the city. Sophie apologized for not being more helpful and suggested I check if the shop still had security footage from back then, though she doubted it. They only kept recordings for 30 days before the system overwrote them. 8 months ago was long gone. I sat down at one of the tables with my coffee, which had gone lukewarm while I was questioning Sophie. My hands were shaking slightly, and I wrapped them around the cup for warmth. Someone had watched me here, studied my routine, asked questions about me. That was 8 months ago, right around when the first fraudulent check would have been written. It couldn't be coincidence. This woman, whoever she was, had been the start of everything. But why? What had I done to attract this kind of attention? What did she want from me? I pulled out my phone and opened the Photos app, scrolling back through months of pictures. I didn't take many photos, mostly just screenshots of recipes or articles I wanted to read later. But occasionally there were pictures of places I'd been, things I'd seen. I was looking for backgrounds, for crowds, for anyone who might appear more than once. It was a desperate search, and I knew it. The odds of catching someone's face in the background of my sparse photo collection were almost zero. But I had to try something. I couldn't just sit and wait. I found her. In a photo I'd taken at the farmer's market 6 months ago. I'd been photographing a display of sunflowers, thinking about buying some for my apartment. In the background, blurred but visible, was a woman with dark hair, watching me. I zoomed in until the image pixelated, trying to make out her features. She was young, maybe early 30s, with a lean face and intense eyes that seemed focused directly on the camera, on me. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at that blurry face. She'd been so close I could have reached out and touched her. I scrolled through more photos frantically. There, in the background of a picture I'd taken of a sunset from my apartment window 3 months ago, a figure on the street below, looking up. The resolution was terrible at that distance, but it could have been the same dark hair, the same slight build. And again, in a photo from a work event, someone at the edge of the frame who didn't quite belong. I couldn't be certain it was the same person each time, but the possibility made my skin crawl. How long had she been following me? How many moments had I missed? I sent the farmer's market photo to Detective Barnes with a message explaining where I'd found it. She responded an hour later, saying she'd look into it, but warning me not to get my hopes up. The image quality was poor, and facial recognition would be nearly impossible with such a blurry shot. Still, it was something. It was proof that Sophie's memory was real, that there had been someone watching. I saved the photo to my desktop and found myself staring at it, trying to recognize something in that distant face. Did I know her? Had we met before? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd had over the past year, trying to place that face from the farmer's market photo. Around 3 a.m, a memory surfaced, hazy and uncertain. A woman at the DMV, maybe 9 months ago, when I'd gone to renew my license. She'd been standing behind me in line, and we'd chatted briefly about how slow the process was. Nothing remarkable about the conversation, but she'd been friendly, warmer than most strangers in a DMV line. She'd asked where I worked, what I did. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Had that been her? The memory was so vague I couldn't trust it. I remembered dark hair, but that was all. We'd talked for maybe 5 minutes while the line inched forward. She'd seemed interested in what I was saying, asking follow-up questions. I'd thought she was just being nice, killing time. Now I wondered if she'd been gathering information. The DMV would have had all my personal details right there. My address, my signature on file, probably my date of birth. Easy to access if you knew someone who worked there, or if you were patient enough to watch and wait. I got out of bed and opened my laptop, searching for news about DMV employees arrested for identity theft. There were dozens of articles from various states, spanning years. It was apparently a common problem. Employees had access to everything: social security numbers, signatures, addresses, dates of birth. Everything you'd need to steal someone's identity. Everything you'd need to forge checks that looked absolutely authentic. My hands were shaking again as I read article after article. I'd handed myself to her on a silver platter, just by standing in that line and being polite. First thing Tuesday morning, I called the DMV office where I'd renewed my license. After navigating an automated phone tree and waiting on hold for 20 minutes, I finally reached a human being. I explained that I was investigating identity theft and needed to know if they kept records of which employees had accessed my account. The woman on the phone was immediately defensive, saying they took privacy very seriously and couldn't just give out that information. I'd need to file a formal request, probably get law enforcement involved. She made it sound like I was the problem. I called Detective Barnes instead and explained my theory about the DMV. She sounded more interested than she had before, said she'd follow up with them directly. Law enforcement requests carried more weight than civilian ones. She promised to call me back once she knew more. I spent the rest of the morning at work, barely able to focus, refreshing my email every few minutes, waiting for an update. My coworker Lisa asked if I was feeling okay. I looked terrible, she said. I told her I hadn't been sleeping well, which was true enough. Barnes called back just after lunch. She'd spoken with the DMV's security department, and they were conducting an internal investigation. They couldn't confirm anything yet, but they'd found some irregularities in access logs from around the time I'd renewed my license. Multiple employees had pulled my record when only one should have needed to. They were interviewing staff members, but it would take time. Barnes asked if I could come to the station later that day. There was something she wanted to show me, something from the bank's security footage. Her tone suggested it wasn't good news. I left work early and drove to the police station, my stomach tight with anxiety. Detective Barnes met me at the front desk and led me back to a small room with a computer and a monitor. She explained that the bank had finally sent over security footage from the branches where some of the fraudulent checks had been cashed. She pulled up a video file and hit play. The footage was grainy black and white, time-stamped from 3 months ago. It showed a woman approaching a teller window. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing sunglasses indoors, which should have been suspicious, but apparently wasn't. Barnes paused the video and zoomed in on the woman's face. Even with the sunglasses and the poor video quality, I felt a jolt of recognition. The shape of her jaw, the way she held herself, It matched the blurry figure from my farmer's market photo. This was her. This was the woman who'd been watching me, who'd stolen my signature, who'd been draining my account for months. Barnes played the rest of the clip. The woman handed the check to the teller, who looked at it briefly, then processed it without issue. The whole transaction took less than 3 minutes. She walked out of frame, and that was it. Barnes showed me footage from 2 other branches. Similar scenes. Same woman, same sunglasses, same confident approach. She knew what she was doing. She'd probably cashed dozens of fraudulent checks before, maybe for other victims besides me. Barnes said they were running facial recognition even with the sunglasses, but it was slow going. They were also reaching out to the people named on the checks, Marcus Chen and the others, to see if they were accomplices or victims themselves. Maybe she was using stolen identities for them too. Maybe this was bigger than just me. I didn't know if that made me feel better or worse. That night, I did something probably stupid. I searched for Marcus Chen again, but this time I looked specifically for anyone with that name in my city. I found 3 possibilities on social media. The first was a teenager, obviously not involved. The second was a man in his 60s, retired, seemed unlikely. The third was a man around my age, 32, worked in tech, lived across town. His profile was mostly private, but his profile picture showed someone ordinary looking, Asian American, with glasses and a friendly smile. He could have been anyone. He could have been innocent. I sent him a message, trying to sound reasonable and not like a crazy person. I explained that someone had cashed a fraudulent check in his name from my bank account, and I was trying to understand how. If he had any information, could he please contact me? I didn't expect a response. For all I knew, he was in on it, or the account was fake, or he'd never check his messages. I hit send and immediately regretted it. If he was involved, I just tipped him off that I was investigating. If he wasn't, I just terrified some innocent stranger. Either way, it felt like a mistake. To my surprise, he replied within an hour. His message was confused and concerned. He said he'd never received a check from me, or anyone else, for $8,000. Never deposited such a check. Had no idea what I was talking about. He suggested I contact the police if I was dealing with fraud. I explained that I already had, that the police had shown me a check made out to him that had been cashed months ago. There was a long silence before his next message came through. He said we should meet in person. He wanted to see the check. He sounded as unsettled as I felt. We agreed to meet at a cafe downtown the next evening after I got off work. I chose a public place with plenty of people around, just in case this was some kind of trap. I arrived early and sat near the window where I could watch the door. Marcus showed up right on time, looking exactly like his profile picture. Glasses, nervous expression, carrying a laptop bag. He spotted me and came over, and we shook hands awkwardly. He seemed as uncertain about this meeting as I was. We ordered coffee and sat down at a corner table, away from the other customers. I showed him the photocopy of the check with his name on it. He studied it carefully, then pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. He scrolled back through months of transactions, showing me his deposits and withdrawals. There was no $8,000 deposit anywhere. No record of any check from my account. He looked genuinely confused and worried. He said his identity had been stolen once before, a few years ago, someone opening credit cards in his name. He'd thought he'd locked everything down after that, but this was different. This check had never touched his account at all. I asked if he'd been to that particular bank branch, the one where the check was cashed. He said no. He used a completely different bank. We compared timelines, trying to find connections. Around the time the check was cashed, he'd been out of town for work. He could prove it. Travel records, hotel receipts. Someone had used his name and identity to cash a check, but it wasn't him. He was a victim too, just in a different way. We sat in silence for a moment, both trying to process what this meant. The woman from the security footage had stolen both of our identities and somehow merged them together into this fraud scheme. Marcus asked where I thought his information had been stolen from. I told him about my theory, about the DMV, about the woman who'd been watching me. He thought for a moment, then said he'd renewed his license around the same time I had, maybe just a few weeks before. Different office, but the same system, same vulnerability. If someone working there, or with access to their system, wanted to harvest identities, they could grab dozens at once. Match signatures from one person with names from another. Create a whole network of fake checks that would be nearly impossible to trace. It was actually brilliant, in a horrible way. He asked if I'd told the police about this pattern. I said I had, but they were moving slowly, bureaucratically. Marcus opened his laptop and said he might be able to help. He worked in cybersecurity, analyzed data patterns for a living. If we could get the information about the other people named on the checks, Jennifer Walsh, David Park, Sarah Mitchell, Robert Torres, we might be able to find connections, figure out where all their identities were stolen from. It might help the police narrow down their suspect. It might help us find her before she did this to someone else. I felt a rush of relief at not being alone in this anymore. Marcus understood what it felt like to have your identity used against you, to see your name on documents you'd never touched. We exchanged phone numbers and email addresses. He said he'd reach out to the other names on the checks if I could provide them, see if they responded like he had. Meanwhile, he'd do some digging into DMV security breaches, see if there had been any reported issues. We were probably overstepping what civilians should be doing, possibly interfering with a police investigation, but waiting passively felt impossible. We needed answers, and we needed them faster than Detective Barnes could provide them. 3 days later, Marcus called me. He'd found Jennifer Walsh, one of the other names from the checks. She'd responded to his message within hours, and her story was nearly identical to ours. Her identity had been used to cash a fraudulent check, but she'd never received the money. She'd renewed her license at a DMV office across town about 8 months ago. She remembered the wait being long, remembered chatting with other people in line. She couldn't recall anyone specific, but now that she thought about it, there had been a woman who'd been particularly friendly, asking questions that seemed normal at the time, but felt intrusive in hindsight. We set up a group chat with Jennifer and started comparing notes. She was a teacher, 35 years old, lived alone. Like me, she'd lived a quiet life, nothing that would make her an obvious target for identity theft. Marcus reached out to the other names on the checks with mixed results. David Park responded and confirmed a similar story. Sarah Mitchell's account appeared fake, possibly created just for this scheme. Robert Torres never replied, and his social media presence was minimal. But we had enough to see a pattern. Multiple victims, all with recently renewed licenses, all processed through the DMV system in the same month. I forwarded all of this to Detective Barnes, who called me immediately. She sounded excited, or at least as excited as she ever seemed to get. The DMV's internal investigation had identified a former employee who'd been fired a few weeks ago for unrelated misconduct. His name had been floating in the investigation for weeks, but now there was a face to go with it. A woman named Rachel Hoffman, 29 years old, who'd worked at the main office downtown. She'd had access to the entire database, and a preliminary check of her work logs showed she'd pulled records for dozens of people during her employment, including me, Marcus, Jennifer, and David. They were bringing her in for questioning. Finally, we had a name. Detective Barnes sent me a photo from Rachel Hoffman's employee file. The moment I saw it, something in my chest went cold. I recognized her. Not from the farmer's market or the DMV line or any of the places I'd suspected. I recognized her from somewhere older, somewhere deeper in my memory that I'd buried and tried to forget. She was thinner in the photo, her hair shorter, but those eyes were unmistakable. She'd been in my freshman year dorm at college. Not someone I'd known well, but someone I'd seen around. Rachel. The name had been different then, or maybe I was misremembering, but that face. I knew that face. I called Barnes back immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I told her I knew Rachel Hoffman, or at least I'd known her over a decade ago. We've gone to the same college for 1 year before I'd transferred. Barnes asked if we'd been friends. No, I said. We'd barely spoken. I'd been part of a group that... I paused, the memory coming back ugly and sharp. We'd excluded her. There had been a party, a stupid college party where someone had started a rumor about Rachel, and instead of defending her or ignoring it, we'd laughed. I'd laughed. I'd been 18 and thoughtless and cruel in the way only teenagers can be. She'd left school after that year. I'd never thought about her again. Now, she'd thought about me plenty. This wasn't random identity theft. This was revenge, patient and methodical, planned over years. She'd gotten a job at the DMV, waited for me to come in, recognized me after all this time. Maybe she'd been watching me even before then, tracking where I lived, where I worked. The identity theft was just a means to an end. She wanted to hurt me, confuse me, make me doubt my own memory and reality. Those perfect signature forgeries weren't just skilled fraud. They were a message, showing me that she could be me, that she could replace me, just like I'd once made her feel replaced and unwanted. The cruelty had come full circle. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and forced myself to remember that year clearly. Rachel had been quiet, a little awkward, new to the city like most of us. Someone had said something about her. What was it? That she'd lied about where she was from, or about her family having money? Something trivial and stupid. The rumor had spread through our dorm floor like a virus. People started avoiding her, excluding her from study groups and weekend plans. I hadn't started it, but I'd participated in it. I'd laughed at jokes at her expense. I'd walked past her in the hallway without saying hello. There had been a night, I remembered now with sickening clarity, when a group of us had been getting ready to go out. Rachel had knocked on someone's door, hoping to join. We'd told her we weren't going anywhere, then left 15 minutes later, walking right past her door, laughing loudly enough that she must have heard. I remembered her face in the cafeteria after that, how she'd started sitting alone, how she'd stopped trying to engage with anyone. By the end of the semester, she was gone. Someone said she'd transferred. Someone else said she'd dropped out. No one really cared. We'd moved on to other gossip, other targets. We'd forgotten her completely. But she hadn't forgotten us. She'd carried that pain for over a decade, letting it calcify into something harder and sharper. She'd built a life around it, gotten a job where she could access the tools she needed, waited for the perfect opportunity. When I walked into that DMV office to renew my license, she must have felt like the universe was giving her permission. After all these years, I'd walked right back into her reach. I felt sick thinking about it, not because I was angry at her, but because I understood. I'd helped create this. My careless cruelty at 18 had planted seeds that grew into this elaborate revenge. I didn't know if that realization made any of this better or worse. Detective Barnes called the next morning. They'd brought Rachel Hoffman in for questioning, and she'd confessed almost immediately. There was no point in denying it once they'd shown her the evidence, the security footage, the access logs, the connection to all the victims. She'd been calm about it, Barnes said, eerily calm. She'd explained exactly how she'd done it, the technical details of forging signatures, of using mobile deposit to manipulate accounts, of stealing identities and merging them. She'd even kept records, a detailed spreadsheet of every check she'd written, every deposit she'd made. It was all there, organized and methodical. What Barnes didn't understand was why. The money had been cycled back into the victims' accounts eventually, so Rachel hadn't profited from it. She'd just been moving money in circles, creating chaos without financial gain. That was what led Barnes to ask if I knew her personally, if there was history I hadn't mentioned. I admitted everything then. The college connection, the bullying, the way we'd treated her. Barnes was quiet for a long moment. Then she said Rachel had asked to speak to me. Not her lawyer, not her family, me. Barnes said I didn't have to agree to it, that it wasn't standard procedure and probably wasn't a good idea, but Rachel had specifically requested it. I didn't hesitate. I said yes. I needed to face her, to see what I'd helped create, to hear whatever she wanted to say. The meeting was arranged for that afternoon. Barnes would be there the whole time, watching through the glass, ready to step in if needed. But Rachel had made it clear she just wanted to talk. No demands, no threats, nothing to negotiate. Just 5 minutes of my time to say what she'd been planning to say for 12 years. I drove to the station with my stomach in knots, not knowing what to expect, knowing I probably deserved whatever was coming. The interrogation room was smaller than I'd expected. Gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor. Rachel sat on one side, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She wasn't wearing handcuffs. She looked up when I entered, and her expression was neutral, almost pleasant. She looked older than in the employee photo, tired around the eyes, but still recognizable as the girl I'd half remembered from college. She gestured to the chair across from her, and I sat down. Detective Barnes stood near the door, arms crossed, watching carefully. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then Rachel said my name quietly, like she was testing it out. She asked if I remembered her. I said yes, that I'd remembered after seeing her photo, that I remembered what we'd done to her. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already known. She told me she'd never forgotten any of us, especially not me. She said I'd been the one she'd considered a friend at first, before everything happened. We'd had a few conversations early in the semester. Nothing deep, but enough that she'd thought maybe we'd be friends. That betrayal had hurt the most, she said. Not the ringleaders. Me. The one who could have chosen differently. I opened my mouth to apologize, but she held up a hand. She didn't want apologies. She'd heard enough hollow apologies in her life. What she wanted was for me to understand what it felt like to have your sense of self erased by someone else. To see your signature, your name, your identity being used by another person and feel powerless to stop it. She wanted me to know what it was like to question reality, to doubt your own memory. She'd spent months planning this, perfecting it, waiting for me to come into the DMV. When I finally did, she'd known exactly what she would do. She'd studied my handwriting from the signature on file. She'd practiced until she could replicate it perfectly. Rachel explained that every check she'd written was deliberate. The names were other people from our freshman year, other people who'd hurt her, excluded her, laughed at her. She'd tracked them all down over the years, collected their information piece by piece. Marcus Chen had been in our dorm building. Jennifer Walsh had been in one of her classes. David Park had been someone who'd specifically told her she wasn't welcome at a party. They might not remember her, might not even remember that year clearly, but she remembered everything. She'd kept it all cataloged and burning inside her for over a decade. The money itself had never been the point, she said. She'd made sure the accounts stayed balanced because she didn't actually want to destroy us financially. She wanted us to feel violated, confused, afraid. She wanted us to experience a fraction of what she'd felt when she'd been erased from that social circle, when she'd been made to feel like she didn't exist or matter. The checks were symbolic. They represented her taking control of our identities the way we'd tried to control hers by spreading rumors and excluding her. She'd become us, literally, by forging our signatures. She'd stepped into our lives and rearranged them without permission. I listened to all of this and felt a weight pressing down on my chest. She was right, in a horrible way. Not about the method, not about the crime, but about the core of it. We had tried to erase her. We had treated her like she was nothing, like her feelings and her humanity didn't matter. And because we'd forgotten about it so easily, moved on with our lives while she'd been left to carry that trauma alone, she'd found a way to make sure we'd never forget again. She'd turned herself into a ghost haunting our bank accounts, our sense of security, our trust in reality itself. I understood her. I hated that I understood her, but I did. Rachel leaned back in her chair and looked at me with something that might have been disappointment. She said she'd imagined this conversation so many times, rehearsed what she'd say, how I'd react. In her imagination, I'd deny everything, make excuses, try to minimize what had happened. Then she'd lay out all the evidence of what she'd done, watch me realize the scope of it, see the fear in my eyes. That was supposed to be the satisfying part, the moment of triumph. But actually sitting here, looking at me, looking back at her, with recognition and guilt and sadness, she felt nothing, just emptiness. The revenge hadn't healed anything. It had just been another way to stay stuck in the past. She told me she'd started therapy a few years ago, worked through a lot of the trauma from college and other things in her life. She'd thought she was doing better, moving forward. Then she'd seen me walk into the DMV, and all that old rage had come flooding back like it had never left. She'd told herself this would be cathartic, that finally doing something would give her closure. Instead, it had just consumed the past year of her life. She'd spent so much time planning and executing this scheme that she'd neglected everything else. She'd lost her job for cause, which meant finding another one would be nearly impossible. She'd isolated herself. She'd become obsessed. And now she'd be facing criminal charges that would follow her for the rest of her life. I asked her why she'd confessed so quickly, why she hadn't even tried to fight the charges. She smiled sadly and said there was no point. She'd wanted us to know it was her. That was the whole reason for doing it. An anonymous crime wouldn't have meant anything. She needed us to connect the dots, remember her, realize this wasn't random. The spreadsheet she'd kept, the detailed records, those were meant to be found eventually. She'd wanted credit for her methodical revenge, wanted us to understand how much time and thought she'd put into hurting us. She'd constructed her own capture into the plan. This interrogation room, this conversation. This was the real endpoint she'd been working toward all along. I sat in silence for a long time, trying to find words that weren't empty or self-serving. Finally, I told Rachel that I was sorry, truly sorry, for what I'd done when I was 18. I couldn't take it back, couldn't undo the pain I'd caused. I'd been careless with someone else's humanity, and that was unforgivable, regardless of my age at the time. I told her I understood why she'd done this, even though I couldn't condone it. I understood the need to be seen, to make the people who'd hurt you acknowledge what they'd done. I'd spent most of my adult life trying to be invisible, hiding from connection, and maybe that was my own form of penance. Maybe I'd known, on some level, that I deserved to be forgotten the way I'd forgotten her. Rachel studied my face while I spoke, and something in her expression softened slightly. She said she'd wondered sometimes if any of us had grown up, if we'd become different people than those cruel teenagers. She'd hoped, in a way, that we'd all stayed shallow and thoughtless, because that would make it easier to hate us. Finding out that we'd changed, that we might have become better people, complicated the revenge. It meant she was punishing someone for a past self that might not fully exist anymore. But she didn't know how else to get free of that year, that pain. She'd tried forgiveness, tried moving on, tried everything. The anger had persisted like a chronic illness. This had been her last desperate attempt at a cure. I told her that hurting us hadn't cured her, and being hurt hadn't cured me either. We were both just carrying more damage now, but maybe that was the point, not to cure anything, but to force everyone involved to stop pretending it hadn't happened. She'd made it impossible for me to forget her again, impossible to hide from what I'd done. That accountability was worth something, even if the method was destructive. She nodded slowly, and I saw tears in her eyes for the first time. She said she'd needed to hear that, needed someone to witness her pain and say it was real, it mattered, it had consequences. That was all she'd really wanted. Not the money, not the revenge, just to be seen. Detective Barnes stepped forward and said our time was up. Rachel needed to speak with her lawyer, and I needed to leave. Rachel and I stood at the same time, awkward in the small space. For a second, I thought about offering to shake her hand, but that felt absurd given the circumstances. Instead, I just said I hoped she found peace eventually, whatever that looked like. She said the same to me. Then Barnes was guiding me out of the room, down the hallway, back to the normal world where people weren't confronting decade-old betrayals in police interrogation rooms. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. The afternoon sun was too bright, the traffic too loud. I felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. Rachel would be charged with multiple counts of fraud and identity theft. She'd probably serve time. Her life would be defined by this crime for years, maybe forever. And I would move forward, knowing that my carelessness at 18 had set all of this in motion. Neither of us had won anything. We'd just both lost in different ways. I drove home slowly, taking surface streets instead of the highway. I needed time to think, to process. Part of me felt angry at Rachel for dragging me into her pain so dramatically, for committing crimes that would hurt her far more than they'd hurt me. But a larger part understood that she'd been drowning in unresolved trauma, and this had been her way of trying to surface. I'd contributed to her drowning. I couldn't blame her for the way she'd tried to breathe. That didn't make what she'd done right, but it made it human. Painfully, destructively human. That evening, I called Marcus and Jennifer, told them what I'd learned. The silence on the phone was heavy when I explained the college connection, the reason behind the targeted fraud. Marcus said he barely remembered Rachel from freshman year, though the name sounded vaguely familiar. Jennifer was quiet for a long time before admitting she remembered her clearly. She'd been one of the people who'd spread rumors, she said quietly. She'd felt guilty about it on and off over the years, but had convinced herself it wasn't that serious, that everyone was cruel at that age. Now she understood how wrong she'd been, how much harm they'd all caused. We talked about whether to reach out to David Park, the fourth victim who'd responded, and tell him the truth. In the end, we decided he deserved to know. We set up a video call with all four of us. David was shocked when we explained everything, said he honestly didn't remember Rachel at all. That seemed to hurt in its own way. The idea that he'd contributed to someone's suffering so casually he hadn't even retained the memory. We all sat with that discomfort for a while. Then Jennifer asked what we were supposed to do now. Just move forward, knowing we'd been terrible people once? How did you atone for something you couldn't undo? Marcus suggested we each write letters to Rachel, if she'd agree to receive them. Not excuses, not asking for forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Testimony that what happened had been real and wrong, that we each took responsibility for our parts in it. Jennifer thought we should make donations to organizations that dealt with bullying and trauma. David said he'd been seeing a therapist for other issues and was going to bring this up, work through it properly. I didn't know what I'd do. Probably all of those things. Probably not enough. We agreed to stay in touch, to check in with each other. We'd been brought together by Rachel's revenge, and maybe that accidental community was part of how we'd move forward, connected by shared guilt instead of isolated by denial. In the weeks that followed, the bank reversed the fraudulent checks and fixed my account records. Detective Barnes closed the case with Rachel's confession. The DMV fired several employees in the aftermath and claimed they'd be implementing new security measures, though I doubted much would really change. Life returned to normal on the surface. I went to work, came home, followed my routines. But everything felt different now. I noticed people in ways I hadn't before. The quiet ones, the excluded ones, the people moving through spaces like they were trying not to be seen. I wondered how many Rachels there were, carrying old wounds that no one else remembered inflicting. I started going to a different coffee shop. I couldn't bring myself to return to Morning Grounds, where Rachel had watched me. Sophie, the barista, had just been doing her job, being friendly. But the whole place felt contaminated by surveillance now. In the new shop, I made a point of smiling at the staff, learning names, being present in a way I hadn't been before. Small changes, probably meaningless, but they felt important. I was trying to be less invisible, less disconnected. I was trying to be someone who wouldn't forget people so easily. I wrote a letter to Rachel, but never sent it. I didn't know if she'd want to hear from me outside the formal investigation, and I didn't want to inflict my need for absolution on her. The letter was more for me anyway. a way to articulate what I'd learned, what I'd carry forward. I kept it in my desk drawer and read it sometimes when I needed to remember why connection mattered, why carelessness had consequences. I'd been sleepwalking through my life for a long time, and Rachel had shocked me awake in the most violent way possible. I couldn't thank her for that, but I couldn't entirely regret it either. Marcus and I started meeting for lunch every couple of weeks. What had started as shared trauma had evolved into an actual friendship, which felt strange and valuable at once. He was easy to talk to, thoughtful in ways most people weren't. We didn't always talk about Rachel or the fraud. Sometimes we just talked about work, about books we were reading, about the ordinary frustrations of daily life. But the shared experience was always there underneath, a foundation that made deeper honesty possible. He understood what it felt like to question your own security, to realize how fragile your sense of control really was. One afternoon, Marcus told me he'd been researching identity theft patterns and had written an article about security vulnerabilities in DMV systems. Several cybersecurity journals had expressed interest in publishing it. He was turning what happened to us into something constructive, something that might prevent future attacks. I admired that. His ability to transform the experience into action. I asked what I could do that might be similarly useful. He suggested I volunteer with a nonprofit that worked with college students dealing with bullying and social trauma. I could use my experience, my understanding of the long-term damage, to maybe help someone else avoid Rachel's path. Or avoid mine. I looked into it and found an organization that trained peer counselors. They were skeptical of me at first. I had no counseling background, no professional qualifications. But when I explained honestly why I wanted to help, what I'd learned about the lasting impact of casual cruelty, they were willing to give me a chance. I started training in the fall, learning how to listen without judgment, how to witness someone's pain without trying to fix it or minimize it. It was harder than I'd expected, confronting stories that mirrored Rachel's over and over. But it also felt like the beginning of something necessary. Not redemption exactly, more like responsibility. Rachel's sentencing hearing was in November. I didn't attend, but Detective Barnes kept me updated. Rachel had pleaded guilty to all charges, which reduced the sentence somewhat. Her lawyer had presented evidence of her trauma history, the bullying she'd experienced, her mental health struggles. The judge acknowledged these factors, but was clear that they didn't excuse identity theft and fraud. Rachel received 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. It felt simultaneously too harsh and not harsh enough. She'd been punished for handling her pain badly, which seemed unjust. But she'd also deliberately hurt multiple people, and that deserved consequences. There was no neat resolution to any of it. Barnes told me Rachel had requested that any victim impact statements be shared with her after sentencing. I'd written one, as had Marcus, Jennifer, and David. None of us asked for harsh punishment. Instead, we'd tried to explain how the experience had changed us, forced us to confront our own capacity for harm, made us think about accountability and compassion in ways we hadn't before. We'd each included some version of an apology, an acknowledgement of what we'd done to her. I didn't know if that would mean anything to Rachel, or if it would just feel like too little too late. But it felt important to try. Barnes said Rachel had cried when reading the statements, which surprised everyone. Her demeanor throughout the investigation and trial had been so controlled, so detached. But apparently, seeing the apologies written out, understanding that we'd actually remembered, that we'd actually taken responsibility, had broken through that control. Her lawyer said it was the first time Rachel had seemed to believe that the college bullying had affected anyone besides her. She'd spent so long convinced we'd all forgotten, that we were monsters who'd moved on without guilt. Learning we'd carried our own pain, our own regret, that seemed to matter to her. Maybe that acknowledgement was what she'd really needed all along, more than the elaborate revenge. A few weeks after the sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through Detective Barnes. It was from Rachel, written from the facility where she was serving her sentence. The letter was formal at first, thanking me for the victim impact statement, acknowledging that my apology had been meaningful. Then it became more personal. She wrote about the relief she'd felt, finally confronting us, even though it had come at such a high cost. She wrote about realizing during the trial that her revenge hadn't been about us at all. Not really. It had been about trying to matter, to make her pain visible. She'd been screaming into a void for years, and the fraud had been her way of forcing someone to hear her. She wrote that she'd started therapy again in prison, working with a counselor who specialized in trauma. She was learning, slowly, that what had happened to her in college had been part of a larger pattern in her life. She'd experienced rejection and cruelty before, would probably experience it again. But she'd chosen to make that 1 year definitive, to let it eclipse everything else. She'd given us more power than we'd deserved by making us the central villains of her life story. She was working on rewriting that story now, making herself the main character, instead of making us the reason for her suffering. It was hard work, she wrote, harder than planning and executing elaborate fraud. But it felt more real. The letter ended with something I hadn't expected. She wrote that she hoped I was doing okay, that the fraud hadn't damaged my life too permanently. She hoped I wasn't carrying too much guilt, that I was able to forgive my 18-year-old self for being thoughtless and cruel. We'd both been young and stupid, she wrote. The difference was that her stupidity had come later and had been criminal. But maybe we'd both learned something. Maybe we could both move forward as different, more conscious people. She signed it simply with her name. No pleasantries, no false wishes for future friendship. Just an honest ending to a painful chapter. I spent a week thinking about whether to write back. Barnes had said it was allowed, that Rachel could receive letters as long as they went through proper channels. But I wasn't sure if I should. We weren't friends, would never be friends. Our connection was built entirely on harm. The harm I'd caused her, the harm she'd caused me. Was there value in maintaining that connection, or would it just keep us both stuck in the past? I asked Marcus what he thought. He said he'd already written to her. Kept it short, just thanked her for her letter and wished her well. No deep processing, no attempt at ongoing dialogue, just acknowledgement and closure. I decided to do the same. I wrote a brief letter thanking her for her honesty, telling her I was glad she was getting real help. I told her about the peer counseling training, how I was trying to use what had happened to maybe prevent similar situations for other people. I didn't ask for her forgiveness. I didn't try to extend the conversation. I just acknowledged that we'd both been changed by what happened between us, 12 years ago and now. Then I signed my name and sent it before I could overthink it. A week later, Barnes told me Rachel had received it and wouldn't be writing back. That was fine. That felt like the right ending. Recognition without entanglement. Winter came, and with it, a strange sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. The fraud case was closed. Rachel was serving her sentence. My accounts were secure, my routines reestablished. But I was different inside those routines. More aware, more careful, more present. I thought about Rachel sometimes, wondered how she was coping with prison, if the therapy was helping, if she'd eventually find peace. I thought about my 18-year-old self sometimes too. That careless girl who'd thought social cruelty was harmless because she'd never experienced its long-term effects. I forgave her. Mostly. Understanding wasn't the same as excusing, but it was something. It was a start.
Jennifer reached out in January with an idea. As a teacher, she wanted to develop a curriculum about the long-term impacts of bullying and social exclusion. She wanted to use our story, anonymized and adapted, as a case study. She'd already started drafting lesson plans that would help students understand how casual cruelty could echo across years, how small actions could compound into major trauma. She asked if Marcus, David, and I would be willing to review the materials, maybe even speak to her students about our experiences, not the criminal details, but the emotional core of it. The way we'd failed Rachel, and the way that failure had come back to teach us lessons we should have learned far, far earlier. We all agreed to help. Marcus contributed his cybersecurity expertise to a section on identity protection. David, who worked in social services, provided resources about trauma-informed approaches to conflict. I worked with Jennifer on the sections about accountability and apology, how to take responsibility for harm you've caused, even years after the fact. The curriculum became something we were all proud of, a genuinely useful tool that might spare other people from walking Rachel's path, or ours. Jennifer piloted it with her high school students that spring, and the response was powerful. Kids opened up about their own experiences with bullying, both as victims and perpetrators. Some cried. Some apologized to people they'd hurt. Some asked for help. The curriculum got attention from other schools in the district. Jennifer was invited to present it at an education conference. Local news did a story about it, carefully avoiding the specific details of our case, but focusing on this innovative approach to social emotional learning. Watching something constructive emerge from such a destructive situation felt surreal. Rachel had tried to hurt us, and in some ways she'd succeeded. But the pain had metabolized into awareness, and that awareness had generated something that might actually help people. It wasn't redemption, and it didn't erase what any of us had done, but it was transformation, which was maybe more valuable anyway.
A year after I'd walked into the bank and seen my handwriting on that first fraudulent check, I went back to the same branch. Sandra was still working there, still pulling her hair back in the same tight bun. She recognized me immediately and smiled, asked how I was doing. I told her I was okay, that the case had been resolved, that I'd learned a lot from the experience. She seemed genuinely glad to hear it. She said she'd felt terrible about being the one to deliver that bad news, had worried about me for months afterward. I assured her she'd done nothing wrong, had actually helped by catching the fraud when she did.
We chatted for a few more minutes, and then I completed my transaction. Just a normal deposit, nothing dramatic. Leaving the bank, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't expected. The fear and confusion that had dominated this day a year ago were gone, replaced by something more complex but less consuming. I understood now what had happened and why. I understood my role in creating the circumstances that led to Rachel's revenge. I'd taken responsibility for that and was actively working to be better. Rachel was serving her sentence and getting help. The other victims had processed their own connections to what happened. Everyone was moving forward in whatever way they could. It wasn't a happy ending, exactly. But it was an ending, which was what we'd all needed. I drove past Morning Grounds on the way home and noticed it had closed, replaced by a chain coffee shop. I felt a small pang of loss, even though I'd stopped going there months ago. So much had changed in a year. The landscape of my life looked different now. New coffee shop, new friends, new sense of purpose, new understanding of my own capacity for harm and growth. I thought about calling Marcus, telling him about the anniversary, but decided against it. He'd remember on his own if he needed to. Some things didn't require marking or discussion. Some things just were, part of your history, woven into who you'd become. This was that kind of thing now. Not a crisis to manage, just a fact of my life. The year I was targeted by someone I'd wronged. The year I learned to pay attention. In the spring, 18 months after her sentencing, I received another letter from Rachel through Detective Barnes. She was up for parole in a few months and had been asked to document her rehabilitation progress. Part of that process involved reaching out to victims, demonstrating genuine remorse and changed behavior. Barnes had warned me the letter might be coming, said I should respond only if I felt comfortable doing so. I opened it carefully, unsure what to expect. The letter was longer this time, more detailed about her daily life in prison, her therapy sessions, her plans for after release. She wrote about taking a correspondence course in social work, wanting to eventually help other people deal with trauma in healthier ways than she had. She wrote about the moment she'd decided to confess everything to the police. She'd been sitting in her apartment the night before they brought her in, looking at her spreadsheet of revenge, and she'd realized she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not even anger anymore. Just emptiness. The elaborate scheme that had consumed a year of her life suddenly seemed pointless and small. She'd hurt people, risked her freedom. And for what? We still didn't really know her. We still hadn't suffered the way she'd suffered. The revenge had been a fantasy of power and control, but executing it had just made her feel more powerless than ever. So she'd decided to confess, to at least end it on her own terms. She asked if I'd be willing to write a letter supporting her parole, acknowledging that I believed her remorse was genuine, that I thought she'd successfully rehabilitated. I could refuse, she wrote, and she'd understand. But if I felt able to do it, it would help her case. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or friendship, just acknowledgement that she'd changed, that she was working to become someone different than the person who'd committed those crimes. I put the letter down and looked out my window at the street below, watching people pass by with their shopping bags and strollers and dogs. All of them carrying invisible histories, invisible pains, all of them trying to move forward. I decided I would write the letter, not because I owed her anything, but because I believed everyone deserved a chance at transformation. I wrote carefully, trying to be honest without being either harsh or overly sympathetic. I explained my role in what had happened between us in college, not to excuse her actions, but to provide context. I described the impact of the fraud, the fear and confusion it had caused. Then I wrote about her confession, her explanation during our meeting at the police station, the letters she'd sent since. I wrote that I believed her remorse was real, that her commitment to therapy and education demonstrated a genuine desire to change. I noted that while her actions had been criminal and harmful, they'd also been rooted in unresolved trauma that she was now addressing properly. I recommended parole with appropriate conditions, continued therapy, restitution payments. Marcus, Jennifer, and David also wrote letters after Rachel reached out to them. We compared notes afterward and found that we'd all said similar things. We'd all acknowledged her progress, recommended parole, hoped she'd find a way to contribute positively to society after release. None of us had forgotten what she'd done or minimized it, but we'd all recognized that punishment alone wouldn't heal anyone. If Rachel could transform her pain into something constructive, the way we were trying to transform ours, then everyone would benefit. Her continued imprisonment served no purpose at that point. She wasn't dangerous, she was just damaged, and she was working to repair that damage. The parole board granted Rachel early release in June, 17 months into her 3-year sentence. Barnes called to tell me, asked if I wanted details about the conditions of her parole. I said no. I trusted the system to monitor her appropriately, and I didn't need to know the specifics. I hoped she'd succeed, hoped she'd build the life she'd written about in her letters. But I also needed distance. Our connection had served its purpose, forcing both of us to confront uncomfortable truths about harm, accountability, and forgiveness. Now it was time to let that connection fade. She had her path forward, and I had mine. They didn't need to intersect anymore. 3 months after her release, I saw Rachel at the public library. I'd gone to pick up a book I'd requested, something for my peer counseling work. I was browsing the shelves near the checkout desk when I noticed her standing in the computer section, filling out what looked like a job application. My first instinct was to leave before she saw me, to avoid the awkwardness of an unexpected encounter. But I hesitated, watching her for a moment. She looked different. Thinner, older, tired but focused. She was dressed professionally, her hair neat, her movements careful. She looked like someone trying very hard to present themselves as stable and employable and worthy of a second chance. She glanced up and saw me before I could decide what to do. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she walked over, stopping a few feet away, maintaining respectful distance. She said my name as a question, and I confirmed it with a nod. She asked if I had a minute to talk, said she understood if I didn't. I said okay, and we moved to a quiet corner near the reference section. She told me she was living in a halfway house, working with a parole officer, applying for social work positions. She'd completed her correspondence degree while in prison and was now trying to get certified as a peer support specialist. She wanted to work with people dealing with trauma and criminal justice involvement. I told her that sounded like meaningful work, that I hoped she found a good position. She thanked me for the parole letter, said it had made a real difference in the board's decision. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she'd been worried about running into me, or one of the others. Hadn't known how it would feel or what she'd say. But actually seeing me talking face to face without police or lawyers or court proceedings, it felt like a relief. It made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. We were just two people who'd hurt each other at different times, both trying to do better now. Neither of us was a villain or a victim exclusively. We were just human, complicated and flawed and capable of growth. We ended up getting coffee at the library cafe, a strange echo of my meeting with Marcus 2 years earlier. We talked for almost an hour, carefully at first, then with increasing honesty. She told me about prison, about the women she'd met there, about the therapy program that had genuinely helped her process her trauma. She talked about the shame of having a criminal record, how it followed her into every job application, every housing situation. But she also talked about feeling freer than she had in years. The anger that had consumed her for so long was finally manageable. She could think about her past without being trapped by it. She was learning to define herself by who she was becoming, rather than what had been done to her. I told her about the peer counseling training, about Jennifer's curriculum, about Marcus's cybersecurity work. I told her how the fraud had forced all of us to reckon with what we'd done in college, how it had actually made us better people in weird and painful ways. She laughed at that, said she'd committed fraud as a public service then. I laughed too, even though it wasn't really funny. But there was something absurdly perfect about it. Her crime had been an act of revenge that accidentally became an act of redemption for everyone involved. None of us would have examined our capacity for cruelty if she hadn't forced us to. We'd all been transformed by her anger, just not in the way she'd intended. Before we left, she asked if I'd be willing to meet again sometime, not as perpetrator and victim, but just as two people who'd been through something together. She wasn't looking for friendship exactly, just occasional contact with someone who understood this specific, strange journey. I thought about it and said yes. We exchanged phone numbers, agreed to check in every few months. It felt risky, maintaining any connection with someone who'd committed crimes against me, but it also felt honest. We'd been entangled by harm, and we were choosing to stay loosely connected through healing. That seemed like its own kind of justice, more restorative than punitive. We were both accountable to each other now, witnesses to each other's continued growth. That accountability might be the most valuable thing either of us had gained from this whole terrible experience. I told Marcus about running into Rachel, and he surprised me by saying he'd like to meet her as well. He'd been thinking about her situation, he said, and wanted to understand better how someone got from being a hurt college freshman to a sophisticated fraudster. He wanted to hear it directly from her, not filtered through police reports or letters. I arranged a meeting at a coffee shop, neutral territory, just the three of us. Rachel was nervous when she arrived, clearly unsure what to expect from Marcus. But he was kind, asking genuine questions about her experience, her thought process, her journey toward choosing crime as a solution to her pain. They ended up talking for hours, while I mostly listened. Marcus explained how her fraud had actually inspired his cybersecurity work, how studying her methods had helped him identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited by less ethical hackers. She'd inadvertently contributed to making systems more secure by demonstrating how weak they were. Rachel seemed moved by this, the idea that something good had emerged from her worst actions. She told Marcus she'd been contacted by a researcher studying identity theft patterns, asking if she'd be willing to be interviewed about her techniques. She was considering it, thought maybe she could help prevent future crimes by explaining how easy it had been to exploit the system.
By the end of the meeting, the three of us had formed an odd kind of triangle, connected by crime, but also by the work we were all doing to transform that crime into something meaningful. We weren't friends exactly. The foundation was too strange for normal friendship. But we were something, bound by shared history and shared commitment to being better than we'd been. We agreed to stay in touch, to support each other's projects when we could. Marcus was developing a workshop on identity protection for college students. Rachel was hoping to start a support group for people dealing with justice system involvement. I was expanding my peer counseling work. All of it connected, all of it growing from the same poisoned soil, producing something that might actually nourish others. 6 months later, Rachel's support group had its first meeting at a community center downtown. She'd work with her parole officer and a local nonprofit to get it approved and funded. The group was for people who'd committed crimes and were now trying to rebuild their lives, focusing on addressing the trauma that had led to their criminal behavior in the first place. Rachel asked if I'd be willing to attend as an outside speaker to talk about my experience as a victim who'd been able to move toward understanding and forgiveness. I was hesitant, but I agreed. It felt important to demonstrate that accountability could go both ways, that healing was possible even when harm had been severe. The group was small that first night, only 7 people besides Rachel and me. They ranged in age from early 20s to late 50s, diverse in every way except their shared experience of incarceration and the struggle to reintegrate. I told my story honestly, not sugarcoating my role in Rachel's trauma or her role in mine. I talked about how revenge had seemed to solve nothing for anyone, but honest confrontation and accountability had created space for growth. Several people asked questions afterward, tough ones, about forgiveness and trust and whether someone who'd caused harm deserved a second chance. I didn't have perfect answers. I just had my experience, which was messy and complicated, but ultimately hopeful. After I finished speaking, a woman in her 40s stood up and shared her own story. She'd committed fraud too, embezzlement from her employer after years of being underpaid and overworked. She'd felt justified at the time, like she was taking what she deserved. But the guilt had consumed her, and she'd eventually confessed. Now she was out and trying to rebuild, but she carried so much shame. Hearing that I didn't hate Rachel, that I'd been able to recognize my own complicity in creating the circumstances that led to the crime, gave her hope. Maybe her victims could see her as human too. Maybe she could forgive herself. The others nodded, shared similar feelings. Rachel sat quietly, tears on her face, watching the community she'd created begin to form itself. I attended Rachel's support group several more times over the following months, sometimes as a speaker, sometimes just as an observer. Each time, I learned something new about the complexity of crime and punishment, harm and healing. The people in that room had done terrible things, yes, but they were also working harder than almost anyone I knew to understand themselves, to address their trauma, to ensure they never hurt anyone again. They were accountable in ways that most people never had to be. They wore their worst mistakes publicly, on background checks and in whispered reputations. They couldn't hide from what they'd done. That forced honesty, while painful, also seemed to create space for genuine transformation. I started to question my assumptions about justice, about what victims were entitled to, about what perpetrators deserved. The punitive system, prison, punishment, permanent records, seemed designed more to exile people than to heal them. Rachel had needed consequences for her actions, absolutely. But the therapy and community support she'd received were changing her far more than the time in a cell had. The most valuable part of her sentence hadn't been the punishment. It had been the mandatory treatment and the parole conditions that required her to stay engaged with healing work. What if justice focused on that from the start? What if we measured success by growth rather than suffering? I brought these thoughts to my peer counseling work, incorporating ideas about restorative justice and accountability without shame. The young people I worked with responded to it powerfully. They'd all hurt someone or been hurt by someone, sometimes both. They needed frameworks for understanding that pain without getting stuck in blame or victimhood. Rachel's story, carefully edited for anonymity, became a teaching tool. A cautionary tale about letting trauma calcify into revenge, but also a hopeful one about the possibility of change. The kids understood it instinctively, in ways adults often didn't. They hadn't learned yet that people were supposed to be unchangeable, that your worst moment defined you forever. They still believed in transformation. I was learning to believe in it again, too. 2 years after Rachel's release, the four of us, Rachel, Marcus, Jennifer, David, and me, met for dinner to mark the anniversary. It had been 4 years since I'd first seen my handwriting on that fraudulent check. 4 years since the beginning of this strange journey. We chose a quiet restaurant where we could talk without being overheard, aware that our story was unusual enough to attract attention if the wrong person overheard it. We ordered food and spent the first hour catching up on ordinary life things. Marcus had gotten engaged. Jennifer had been promoted to department head at her school. David had changed jobs, moved across town. Rachel had finally found steady work as a peer support specialist at a nonprofit serving justice-involved youth.
As the evening went on, we inevitably circled back to what had brought us together. We talked about how we'd all changed, what we'd learned, what we still struggled with. Jennifer admitted she still felt guilty sometimes, worried she hadn't done enough to make amends. David said he'd tracked down 2 other people from college he'd bullied and apologized to them, something he never would have done without this experience pushing him. Marcus talked about his ongoing work in cybersecurity, how he'd helped several other identity theft victims recover and protect themselves. I talked about the peer counseling program, how it had become central to my sense of purpose. Rachel talked about her support group, which now had a steady membership of 15 and had helped 3 people find housing and employment. Near the end of the night, Rachel raised her glass and proposed a toast. To complicated second chances, she said. To accountability and growth. To being better than we were. We all raised our glasses and drank to that. It felt true. Earned in a way that easy forgiveness never could have been. We'd all been held accountable for our worst actions and had chosen to let that accountability transform us rather than destroy us. That was worth celebrating, even though the path to get here had been painful for everyone involved. As we said goodnight and went our separate ways, I felt grateful for the strange community that had formed from Rachel's revenge. We'd all been isolated by our harm. Her by what she'd experienced, us by what we'd done. Now we were connected by our shared commitment to healing. That connection felt like its own kind of justice. I still think about that first check sometimes. Seeing my perfect handwriting replicated by someone else. It had been such a violation, Such a shock to my sense of self and security. Now I understood it differently. Rachel hadn't been trying to steal my identity. She'd been trying to force me to see hers, to recognize that she existed and mattered and had been damaged by my carelessness. The fraud was a mirror more than a theft, reflecting back my own capacity for harm. In showing me what it felt like to be replicated and replaced, she'd made me understand what I'd done to her, made her feel invisible, replaceable, erased. The punishment had fit the crime perfectly, even if she'd committed a worse crime in delivering it. I'd learned that harm echoes across time in ways we rarely track. My cruelty at 18 had reverberated through 12 years of Rachel's life, shaping her choices, feeding her pain, eventually erupting into criminal action. Her crime had reverberated through my life and the lives of the others, forcing us to confront our past selves, changing our futures. None of it had been simple cause and effect. We'd all made choices at each stage, could have chosen differently, but the connections were real. What we did to each other mattered, even when we forgot about it, even when years passed. Accountability meant tracing those connections honestly, accepting responsibility for our part in the chain of harm, working to break the cycle rather than perpetuate it. 5 years after finding that first fraudulent check, I was a different person, living a different life. I had genuine friendships, meaningful work, a sense of purpose grounded in helping others avoid the mistakes I'd made. I was more careful with people, more aware of the weight that casual words and actions could carry. I'd learned to apologize properly, to sit with discomfort instead of running from it, to value accountability over comfort. These lessons had come at a high price for everyone involved, but they'd come. Rachel had paid the highest price of all, sacrificing years of freedom to teach us what we should have learned naturally. I couldn't thank her for that sacrifice. There were no words for it, no gesture big enough, no apology that would ever fully land. But I could honor it by becoming someone worth what it had cost, by carrying forward what she'd forced us all to learn. I could be better. We could all be better. That was the real ending to this story. Not forgiveness, not revenge. Transformation. The slow, difficult, unglamorous work of becoming people who would never write this story again. Again and again, until it finally, truly stuck.